moving away from that subject for a little bit, you have found so many different ways of writing about the African American experience. There is the personal aspect which you bring up in Boston Year. You write about the historical reimagination, the early cinema. There is poems like Amistad, and I'm just wondering if writing about being an African American has ever gotten in the way of you writing about as a woman. If I think about Venus Hottentot, it's full of references to cultural figures, African American cultural figures, but most of them are men. You do mention Frida Kahlo. She almost being the sole exception. Of course, I'm not counting Bartman. I'm just wondering, does that happen because growing up there were no feminist African American movement? There was no institution through which a figure like Gwendolyn Brooks could become culturally accessible to you.
Well, that's interesting. Brooks could have been as accessible to me, although it's important to note that a lot of black women, in the time when I was being educated, first of all, a lot of my own learning about African American work was autodidactic. I learned some in school, but a lot of it was just reading on my own. And as far as black women poets, or even poets at all, in the early 1980s, it was all about the novel. So poets weren't taught as extensively as they might have been at an earlier time, and I think then now. I think also what I would sort of rephrase from what you say about no black feminist institutions is that the word institutions is key, because black feminism was everywhere, right? It was everywhere in the women I knew, in the women who raised me, aunts or great aunts, and mother and grandmother. It was absolutely a part of how they looked at the world. They just didn't call it black feminism, and also they didn't have some of the same kinds of outlets and spaces that the men had. And yet, so for example, and I never had a black female professor when I was an undergraduate. The people who were my teachers were largely white and black men, because that's who was teaching in the universities at the time. But what I think is interesting about that book is that we can't rush past Sarah Bartman, because she's the center, the point, she's the everything of that book.
Yes.
And she's the raison d'etre of that book. And so I think the way in which the profound feminist identification of what does it mean and what does it take to try to tell that female story, is where that has to be, in a way, maybe read against these other voices that you're looking at. So maybe, and again, I'm just sort of thinking about this for the first time, but maybe those figures that you mentioned, the artists and the writers and the musicians who are so celebrated in the second part of the book, maybe part of the idea is that a Sarah Bartman could not have come to any kind of artistic voice because of the circumstances of her life.
Exactly.
Her life is about truncation, and also, of course, she dies young because of how she's violated. So I'm thinking that there's something important about who has space to speak, and that there's also something very important about the particularly black feminist message of that. Certainly in a lot of my reading, not only by myself, but also outside of the classroom, but in feminist communities, particularly in college, we were just hanging on the every words of, no one was teaching us Audre Lorde in the classroom, but we were reading those words and needing those words, and organizing ourselves around a lot of those principles, and trying to theorize ourselves around those principles that we found in literary black feminism in particular. So I'm sure that also is part of, when I came across the Venus Hottentot story in an essay by Sandra Gilman, because of that feminist perspective, I was able to say, here's this story, but where's her voice?
Yes.
You know, and that knowing that was missing was what then made space for the poetry to take over.
Yes. The reason I bring this question up is
Mm-hmm.
I come from a culture where growing up, we have had many prominent women fiction writers,
Mm-hmm.
but growing up, I didn't really have the poems I memorized were always, and I realized it after I was grown up, were always written by men.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I just wonder what it might have been if I grew up being resonated by women's poems as well. If somehow my training was incomplete as a poet because of that shortcoming.
Yes.
Because by the time you come to theorize, that element, like you said, you know, a child is always soaking up. Pieces are getting buried deep into your memory in your psyche. Is that freshness, is that element of spontaneity still there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, you know, hopefully as we grow, and as the years go by, and hopefully also as we grow as poets, I always hope that each book, so far, so good, each book has set another set of challenges that I've tried to work through. Each book is different. With each book, I feel like I learned something. With each book, I feel like I started out in one place and I ended up someplace else. And that's what I would hope would always be the case. So certainly, in my second book, I felt that I was breaking free of a kind of being a good girl in certain kinds of ways. You know, that I was trying to do something, find a voice that in many ways was more about being an autonomous grown woman. I had one poetry teacher, Derek Walcott, as I'm sure you've read, and I studied with him here in Boston for 1 year of graduate school. And he was a revelatory teacher for me. He opened me in so many ways. I came to him not knowing that I was a poet. I knew that I wanted to be a writer, but I really didn't write poems. And he unlocked that for me. And he unlocked it for me through the lens that made sense for him. As you know, he's a real formalist. He believes in the European tradition and what it has to give poets.
The form
all of that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's his, but of course, his brilliance, and I don't know if he would talk about it this way, is that it is a European tradition that he learned in the Caribbean. People forget this about him all the time. You know, that when you're learning, I'm sure you have much to say about this, that when you're learning an English tradition in the colonial setting, it's not the same thing.
It's not. You're very right.
It's not the same thing. So even when he hears Shakespeare recited, he's hearing it recited by a St. Lucian. You know, so that's going to affect, because of the finely tuned ear of the poet, what you write and what you make, not to mention that his ears are also open to everything else that, you know, he's hearing around him all the time, and the particular kinds of turns of phrase that are particular to that place. And also, he grew up very well aware of the people on the island who made art. So it wasn't just like there was that one heavy-handed graft of the English tradition. But nonetheless, he is a poet and a teacher who believes that you should, you know how to work with iambic pentameter and sonnets and rhymes. So that is how that first book, I think, of mine shows that influence tremendously.